Okay, welcome everybody to another episode of Justice Matters One-on-One, our relatively new interview series where we bring guests into the studio and talk about, for example, books they've written, whether they're true crime books, crime fiction books, or other topics that are sort of justice-centric. And I am thrilled today to be here with a very good friend, a former colleague for decades, a fellow federal prosecutor. We worked together at the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C. We were both violent crime and homicide prosecutors. He spent 35 years as a violent crime prosecutor at the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office, and I'm thrilled to have with me today my friend, Kevin Flynn. Kevin, welcome.
Great. Thanks for having me,
Great to
Glenn.
see you again.
Yeah, we go way back.
We are here to talk about your remarkable new book. It's crime fiction, and it's set in Washington, D.C. in the 1950s, and it is something of a thriller. It's something of a police procedural, and it is a great read. We're going to be talking more about that. It is called Rock Creek. And before we dig into your new book, let me ask you a little bit about your background.
Sure.
How long were you a federal prosecutor, a violent crimes prosecutor?
Well, I joined the U.S. Attorney's Office in 1987 and actually handled my first violent crime cases in about 1990, and either was on the line or a supervisor on the line handling violent crime cases directly or supervising violent crime cases from then on all the way through till 2023. I took 3 years off for family leave because I had two kids who were 10 and 12, and my job obligations were taking me away from home a little bit too much. I had gotten involved in a big gang case that had me getting home way late, and I just woke up one day and said, I've got to take a step back. And that was in 2005, went part-time from 2005 to 6, full-time off 2006 to 2009. But except for that period, I was at it full-time, for all those years.
And what people may not know, and I think it's worth talking about this briefly up front, is even though we were federal prosecutors, we were part of the Department of Justice. Specifically, we worked about 6 blocks away from what we call Main Justice. I'm not going to say the land where the bureaucrats dwell. That would be unkind. But, that's the big mammoth building on, Constitution, Pennsylvania Avenue. We were about 6 blocks away at the D.C. United States Attorney's Office. What people may not know is even though we were federal prosecutors, we were also local prosecutors in D.C. We did it all, which is unlike all of the other United States attorneys' offices where they prosecute only federal crime. We did all the federal crime, but we did all the local crime, the street crime. And, that is why we were in court pretty much every day with violent crime cases and other cases. And it was such a vibrant practice, prosecutorial practice. So let me ask you this, something that I always ask people who ever prosecuted murder cases. If you could tell the audience, what is your favorite thing about being a homicide prosecutor? What is your least favorite thing about being a homicide prosecutor?
Wow. Favorite thing was just knowing that you were devoting yourself to achieving justice on behalf of first victims who could never speak again, homicide victims themselves, and also attempting to the best of your abilities to bring justice to the families, the survivors of homicide. The experiences that I had over the course of my career interacting with the families of surviving homicide, the survivors of homicide cases were some of the most heartwarming, inspiring experiences of my life. And that was the best of human nature. And I always said, and still would say today, that the chief characteristic of that job is that every day you're exposed to both the worst and the best of human nature. The worst thing about the job, it's really kind of hard for me to identify something like that and put it in black and white terms like that, because every day there were exhilarations and frustrations almost back to back. The frustrations of just the logistics of putting a homicide case together for trial. I'm not going to say that the stresses ever got to me, at least not consciously, but just there were frustrations built into every day, backed right up against, it seems, moments that were just transcendent, and you just can't. Whether you were one-on-one for the first time with a witness, trying to get them to tell the truth about something you knew that they knew, whether you were in a grand jury working in behind closed doors with 23 members of the community that you could interface with on a case-by-case basis and get sort of the voice of the community or a sense for the community, or trials, which were, they really are the most focused, experience that I could really imagine. And I miss them a lot. I last had one in 2022 and on for several months. And I really still dream about the job. I swear to God.
I miss them as well. Every day I miss trying cases. And when I have been asked the question, what was your favorite part and your least favorite part about being a career homicide prosecutor? My answer is always, I actually had two favorite parts. One was trying cases. There's nothing like it. Nothing is challenging, nothing as rewarding as trying cases. And the other favorite part for me is just as you articulated, working with homicide families. That is something no family should ever be called a homicide family. But the reality is when you have a loved one taken unexpectedly by violent crime, you are now injected into the world of police investigations, grand jury hearings, trials, sentencing, probation, parole. And I mean, nothing wears on a family like that. And I got to kind of shepherd them through that process as the prosecutor in their loved one's case. So those are my two favorite parts. My least favorite part, dead witnesses. And I know we have both experienced losing witnesses because somebody made the hard decision to get involved in a homicide investigation or prosecution as a witness, and then associates of the defendant got after them. So that is, something that you never get over and you live with your entire life. You feel a certain responsibility, even though it wasn't your fault, so to speak. So
I lost two over the years, and I can tell you exactly. One was in 2001. It was 3 weeks after 9/11. It was the third Sunday after 9/11, and my family was going to church. My phone goes off, and it was a witness named Kenny Walker who had testified in a significant gang case in Superior Court. And we couldn't get him to stay away from the old neighborhood. And we moved him. The government sponsored him to be moved to a safe jurisdiction. But he kept going back to Langdon Park because his mom was there, and his mom was there because the father was disabled, and she did not feel that she could move him out of the surroundings. It's the house that was retrofitted to accommodate his handicap. So Kenny was killed, and the second one was just a few years ago. It was 2001, and it was a witness once again who we had attempted to persuade her to move further outside of D.C., the danger zone. November 22nd of 2021, Marsh A. Hazelwood, and got that call when I was in my office, and neither case was ever closed. And I sort of devoted myself as much as I could. And to this day, the detectives on the Kenny Walker case, when I see them, the first thing that we'll talk about, Kenny Walker, anything going on with Kenny Walker.
And you know what, Kevin, maybe in the future, we will dedicate an entire conversation to the witnesses that we lost and how it impacted, I feel guilty saying how it impacted us because it impacted their families and their communities. And I'm not going to tell you my stories now because I'll probably break down and cry. But, losing witnesses is as bad as it gets for a prosecutor, far worse for obviously the witness and their family. But let's move on to pleasanter topics. First of all, tell the viewers a little bit about the story, Rock Creek, without disclosing too much. Give them a flavor of what the book is about.
So back in 2001, there was a Washington intern named Chandra Levy who went missing. Evidence suggested and indicated that the last place that she would have gone before going missing was Rock Creek Park, which to the viewers that you have who are outside the DC area it is just a fascinating place. It is one of the biggest parks inside city limits in the country. It is vastly bigger than Central Park, for example, in New York. But unlike most city parks people are familiar with, it is wild. It is largely just untamed. It isn't sculpted. It is nature at its most beautiful and its most stripped down and stark, and it's just there. And it cuts a line north-south, south to north up to the Maryland line and over. And it's a wonderful place. But it's also, I knew the history of it from having grown up in DC, in the DC area, that it was also back in the 40s, 50s, all the way up until 2001, and even afterwards, known as a dumping place for murdered women. So Chandra's body was found in 2002, and I took on the case and worked it until 2006. We had leads, and in fact, we had leads that led directly towards the person who ended up being arrested and prosecuted for the case, but we couldn't close it. So, as I said earlier, I took family leave in 2006. And in the time that I wasn't taking care of the kids and doing all the stuff that my wife had been doing beforehand, I had 6 hours in the day to burn. I just decided to try to write something about the Levy case. But I knew I couldn't write anything that a true crime about it because
Can't write nonfiction about a pending investigation.
That's exactly right. Everything I knew was secret because it was confidential. And also, even if that had not been the case, I wouldn't have wanted to do something that would seem to capitalize specifically on the Levy case, on Chandra, and on the family. And so I was actually talking about the whole conundrum with a friend of mine who was the agent for another book that I had written. And he said, "Why don't you just fictionalize it?" And I said, it's going to be too close. It's going to be thinly veiled fiction. And so he or I said, well, maybe it should just be set back in time. And so really arbitrarily, I set it 50 years back in time from the day that Chandra's body was found in 2002. So it ends up starting in late May in 1952. And it's funny. It's almost as if there was some subconscious thing going on in the back of my mind in terms of setting it in that time. Yeah, for sure, 50 years, I wanted to be 50 years before, but setting it there, set it right in the same time period when my parents met in DC. It was a time period that I knew a lot about because of stories that they told about the milieu and the time. And it was also a period that was just, it was rich with material that related to themes that could resonate today. So, for example, the two primary themes being boundaries, divisions between society, and race issues having to do not just with race issues on their face, but also race issues having to do with law enforcement. And so, setting it in that park, Chandra's body ended up being found in Rock Creek Park. Setting it in the park gave me a launch pad for a lot of other things that are going on in the book. And just one anecdote I'll tell about Rock Creek Park is that I knew from police officers. I started in the U.S. Attorney's Office in 1987. I knew from police officers who had been on the job back in the 50s that in the 50s, it was quite common for blacks to be actually ticketed if they strayed on the side of the park that was dominated by the white population. So in other words, Rock Creek Park literally divided the city back in the 50s between the quote-unquote white part of the city, which extended over to Georgetown, more affluent, and the quote black part of the city, which extended east all the way to the Capitol and over towards southeast and northeast and all the rest of that. So literally, the justice system, quote-unquote, worked in a way that blacks were punished for even being seen on the other side of Rock Creek Park. So the park ended up not just being a place that could be a destiny of geographic beauty, but also a metaphor for divisions that were present in the city and could actually be projected even till today.
And wouldn't we like to think that we have moved forward in our society? And I think we have in many respects, and yet it feels like today some folks are trying to pull us back into the inequality that was prevalent, far more prevalent back in the 50s, but we're not going to go there in this conversation. It's a conversation for another day, but I appreciate you laying that out. So, okay, Kevin, what I'd love for you to do for the viewers is just kind of tell them a little bit about two of the main characters, Detective Shane Kinnock and U.S. Park Police Officer Bobby Shiflett, because I'm dying to read one or two of my favorite passages that involves a conversation between those two characters.
Sure. When I was first conceiving the book, I knew the place that it was going to happen, which was D.C. I knew the time period was the early 1950s, 1952. And so I had to populate it with characters. So literally I had the place in mind, and I had a rough idea of the victim, whose name in the book is Emily Rose. But there had to be a protagonist, and that character had to be a police officer, obviously. And for years before I started writing Rock Creek, I had in mind a character if I ever sat down to write fiction. And the character would be based on a good friend of ours, a longtime homicide detective who just retired a few months ago, named Danny Whalen. And Danny, his father, he grew up in D.C. His father was a congressman from Ohio for many years. But Danny decided that he wanted to be a police officer, didn't want to go to law school, didn't want to go to grad school, wanted to basically just devote himself to the streets. Very, very smart guy, extremely one of the smartest detectives I ever dealt with. But even back when I first met him, which was like the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, I thought he would be a great character for a certain type of book set in a certain kind of place in DC, because I've always thought of DC as being it. Everybody else, people outside know it as the capital of the free world, quote unquote. But at heart, it's a small town, and that's I had one foot myself in the political side because my mother used to work on Capitol Hill, and I had one foot on the small town side because of growing up in the area. My grandparents lived in Southeast. I was over there every weekend. So that character symbolized both sides of the city that I knew and loved. And that's how he was forged. And he is the thread that runs through the entire book. The entire book, except for 3 flashback scenes, is perceived through the perspective of Shane Kinnock. I needed to have, from the very first conception of the book, I needed to have a sidekick with him, though, because as the reader will find, Shane is a very conflicted character. He has been he's shell-shocked from the war, in the old-fashioned term. He has a wry sense of humor, but he has a heavy burden from his past. And I knew that I wanted to have somebody who would not serve as comic relief per se, but there could be comic moments, and it would be someone who would personify a certain innocence in the book from the start. And so that's why in the scenes from the very first scene, which is set in the park in 1952, Shane and Bobby are pretty much side by side.
And so Shane Kinnock is the kind of grizzled old MPD detective. Those are the city cops, the Metropolitan Police Department, the homicide detectives, for example, that you and I worked with for decades. They spoke for the dead. They tried to close murder cases. And then his sidekick, as you put it, is actually a U.S. Park Police officer named Bobby Shiflett. And he is young and he is green and he's inexperienced, I think, to the extreme. And so the first scene that I want to read a very short passage about, can you kind of set it up? What are these two guys doing in the park and what are they talking about?
Sure. Shane is actually, he's not that old, but he's not that old in years, but he's old in experience. Like a lot of World War II vets who came back from the war, my father included. My father went to college on the GI Bill. He was older than all the rest of the people in his freshman class all the way through. Shane comes back from the war. He's, at the time of the book, he's 35, but he could be 45.
Reads older.
He's
been through it all, yes, good and bad.
Yes, exactly. And so Shane has basically been put on in the backwater, so to speak, in the department over a tussle he had with the higher ups, and so he's been put on the lowest level of homicide assignment duty that you can be on. He basically just tracks down natural deaths. In other words, cases that don't seem as if they're going anyplace, he's on. So he's dispatched to Rock Creek Park because there's a skull that isn't even known to be, whether it's not it's human or animal, has been found in the park. And that's his crime scene. And because it's in a park, there's actually, I wouldn't say dual jurisdiction, but there is dual jurisdiction. I guess that would be the best way to put it, over matters in the park, because MPD is involved in park investigations, but there's also a separate entity called the U.S. Park Police. And so Shiflett is given this same job. He's just dispatched because it's a skull in a park and nobody thinks it's going anyplace. And so he rides over on a horse because park police officers ride horses, and he's on his horse. And, Shane sees him at a distance riding in and thinks, it's like something out of like a TV, like a Western movie or something. Here comes, a Western hero. And in fact, it's this lumpy sort of country, overweight, out of shape guy who like stumbles off the horse. And that's who Shane knows he's going to be partnered with on this thing from that point forward.
So now that you've set that up beautifully, because you've got the MPD detective, Kinnock, and you've got the young, green U.S. Park Police officer who comes galloping in, and now these two guys are on the same crime scene, maybe not. There's a skull found. And this is a quick conversation that they have as they're trying to figure out what to do next. And you say, after they find the skull, Detective Kinnock says, so I'm to assume they never taught you the procedure for dealing with a dead body. And Bobby Shiflett says, And Kinnock says, well, from what you've picked up here and there, What do you think we do next? Shiflett thinks for a minute, then answers firmly, we call the coronator? And Kinnock says, the what? He says, the coronator, the doctor that says how dead people died. It takes Shane Kinnock a second to realize that for the first time this day, this week, this year, he's smiling. Quote, no, he's called the coroner. Shiflett, where'd you grow up anyway? Shiflett says, North Carolina, sir, town called Roanoke Rapids. Kinnock, so when you were growing up down in Roanoke, wherever, and somebody got killed, didn't you ever hear of a coroner taking care of the remains? Shiflett says, nobody ever got killed where I grew up, sir. That is just a little flavor of how good the writing is between these two officers on the scene, meeting one another for the first time. And then as things develop in the story, obviously without giving too much away, there comes a moment where, and we have both experienced this in our work as homicide prosecutors, you've got some remains. Maybe it's a skull. Maybe it's other bones of a body that has completely decomposed. And one of the pivotal moments in this investigation is what kind of a death are we dealing with? Because a medical examiner who performs an autopsy, which is not easy to do when all you have is a skull or some bones, has to rule what happened to this person. And there really are only 5 rulings, right? Homicide, suicide, natural death, died of natural causes, accidental, you're up on your roof cleaning out the gutter and off you go, it's an accident, and the ever popular undetermined, when even the medical examiner can't figure out what happened to this person. And so kind of talk about that experience where they're now trying to figure out where do they go next when all they have is a skull, but they don't know what happened.